Today we'll be talking about how many DNA matches are needed to answer a research question. And this is a common question that comes up in study groups and classes about using DNA evidence in our genealogy research. So I thought it would be fun to talk about this today. And I know a lot of people in our study group have been talking about it. So let's let's discuss it some more. So I was trying to think of some general principles that can help us determine, do we need more matches or fewer matches? One thing that I've kind of noticed with some of the client projects and my own personal projects that I've done with DNA matches is that the closer the research question, generally, the fewer matches are needed. So if the research question is regarding the parent of an adoptee, fewer matches are needed. Then the further you go out, the more matches are needed. So that would be a general principle that can help guide you. Another one is that the closer the matches, the fewer matches are needed. So if you have a lot of close cousin matches that are the closest they possibly can be for your research question, then the fewer matches are needed. But if you don't have any of those close cousin matches that are expected, then you just have more distant matches, you're going to need more. Another thing I've noticed is that the stronger the documentary evidence, the fewer matches are needed. So if you have direct evidence of a parent-child relationship, then you don't need as many DNA matches to add evidence to that case. It's already a strong case, and you maybe will just need a few matches instead of a lot. And then with adoptee cases, um, sometimes the right matches are more important than the quantity of matches, because sometimes you have three brothers that you're trying to rule out, and if you have a whole bunch of matches from one of the brothers but not very matches from the other two, then that still doesn't help you solve the case because you can't rule the other ones out. So let's talk about this with some diagrams. So the closer the research question, the fewer matches are needed. So let's just pretend that we have a research question and the test taker is Joan, and we want to know who Joan's unknown father is. So this is a very close research question, closest one you can get, the test taker's parent. And if we get a half sibling match and Joan's half sibling says, "Oh, I know who our father is," then the research question is solved. You only needed one match. But if you're looking for Joan's unknown father and you don't have any half sibling matches and you have a first cousin match, then you might not be able to solve it with just that first cousin match. You might need some more additional cousins to help you rule out other possible uncles and things that help you determine that it's not these guys, but it is this one. So, depending on how close your research question is, you could just solve it with maybe one match or even just a parent-child match. That's happened before, where you take a DNA test and you find your unknown father because he's your match. But as we go back in the tree and we're trying to find more distant relationships, maybe we're trying to find the relationship of Joan's father to her grandfather, then we're probably going to use a few more matches. All right, here's another example. This goes along with the principle that the closer the matches, the fewer are needed. So if we do get that half sibling match, then we only just need that one half sibling match to figure out the unknown father. But let's say we're working on a more distant question. So the question is, who's the parent of this grandparent? So this is the relationship we're working on. And we've got a second cousin match. That's a pretty close match. And if we have that match, it can help us solve the research question. And we may not need more than two or three of these second cousin level matches. But if we only have third cousins and fourth cousin matches, then we'll probably need to have more of them to help us figure out the answer. So here's another example where we have Joan and we know Joan's father, but we don't know the grandmother. So trying to figure out Joan's unknown grandmother, how many matches will we need to help us with that question? So if we have a first cousin match, that gives us some evidence that Joan and the first cousin share a common ancestor here. But if we don't have a first cousin match and we have a second cousin or we have third cousin matches, then that can give us some evidence that we have this common ancestral up here, but we may not be able to figure out the exact unknown grandmother without a lot more matches and finding out the other side of the family and using many more matches to help us. Here's an example of an adoptee case that I recently was able to finally solve because 2 new matches came in. And this is an example where really only needed a few matches, but they needed to be the right matches. So I had found 22 matches on the one side of the family that later I determined was the father's side. And there were, even after looking at all of these 22 matches, there was still the potential for 3 different men to be the father. They were brothers. And finally, a match came in that was a 601 centimorgan match who turned out to be 2 generations younger than the test taker, the adoptee. And so she was the first cousin twice removed after I'd solved, figured it out. And the fact that she was sharing such a high amount, but was still a first cousin twice removed, indicated that this was the correct branch. And so they shared um, this person's this person's grandparents um, were the sibling. And so this one match is the one that finally was made it possible to be solved. And so I didn't need all of these 22 matches. I really only needed like 2 or 3 or 4 of them to help me figure out the ancestral couple and then to find those potential brothers. And then this one match solved it. So couldn't solve it with 22, just needed this special one. Then on the mother's side of this adoptee case, there were 4 matches that helped figure out the common ancestral couple for the mother's side. And there were 3 sisters in the family who could have been the mother. And I wasn't able to solve it until there was a match that appeared recently that shared 1,185 centimorgans. And this match turned out to be a first cousin. And because when we put this into what are the odds, it made it way less likely to be on that sister's branch. And so it turned out to be the other sister's branch. And that was the sister where the documentary evidence was pointing to as well. So getting the right matches ended up being more important than having a large quantity of matches for this case. So here is an example of using a case of strong documentary evidence. And because there was direct evidence for each generation, then not that many matches were needed. I was confirming paper trail evidence on my dad's side. And in this case, the elder case, I was using direct documentary evidence for my dad to his father and then to the grandfather and then one more generation back. And what I ended up using were I used one match between my father and his father because they both tested. So that confirmed that generation. And then for the next generation back, if you're going from a grandparent to a great grandparent, when I went from my grandpa elder to his father, I used 2, maybe 3 matches. And then going back to the next generation, it was about 2 to 4 matches. And then the next generation, about 4 to 6 matches. And the principles I was following with this case were to use independent descent lines from different children if possible. And this isn't always possible because families are unique. Some don't have a lot of children. And sometimes you just have matches from one because one of the other children, maybe there were two children that you could possibly find matches through, and one of them didn't have descendants living to today. So you just only have the one option. Another principle I was trying to do is get matches that were generationally close. So I don't want to use all the most distant matches who are 2 and 3 generations removed from my grandfather, but trying to get the ones that are closer. And then any matches that had multiple relationships, I usually would throw out. And there were a couple like that. And that causes the amount of shared centimorgans to be inflated. So it just makes it a little bit easier to not use those. But sometimes you do have to use those. And so you use the matches that you have and the best ones that you can. And you don't need to use all of them all the time. So you can sometimes get rid of ones that are unnecessary if they're far away, they're more distant, and they have problems like multiple relationships. Another thing you can do to choose which matches you want are to choose ones that have more full pedigrees instead of ones that are missing half of their pedigree or have an unknown grandparent, because then it increases the chance that they're related through more than one set of common ancestors. And another thing that I like to do when I'm choosing which matches to include are to focus on ones where it was easy to document the lines of descent from the common ancestor. And sometimes there will be a match where their particular ancestor is difficult to place as the child of the hypothesized common ancestral couple because there just weren't very many records for that person, or they were older than the rest of the family, so they don't appear on a census with them all. And so if you have a lot of matches to choose from, then you might not want to choose the ones that are harder to document. Um, Usually I do end up using as many as I can through independent descent lines because it strengthens the argument, even if they're challenging. And I had to write a few proof arguments and proof summaries for some of those lines of descent that were difficult to document. But um, I think it's worth it to strengthen the case. In my proof argument about Bathsheba Tharp's father, I started off with 14 test takers or descendants of Bathsheba, who was my research subject. And then her hypothesized father is Lewis Tharp. And I had a lot of descendants of him through his first wife and through his second wife. Through the first wife, um, the three children of Lewis Tharp and his first wife, Joanna West, were Elizabeth and then Bathsheba, I believe, and William. And I didn't have any matches through William, only through Elizabeth. So that was just what I had to work with. And there ended up only being a few matches through, there were only 5. And so I just had to use what I had for that line. And then for descendants of Lewis Tharp and his second wife, I had 8 descendants through 3 of his children. So this was a little bit stronger. And then I wanted to strengthen the case because I had a lot of DNA matches from Lewis Tharp's parents. So I thought that strengthened the case quite a bit. So I included 4 descendants of Lewis's parents through different siblings of Lewis. And these ones were difficult to document because this was going back into the earlier 1700s. And so this is where I had to write some proof arguments for some of those relationships to parents. And they weren't too challenging to write, but it did require that extra step. But I felt like I did kind of overkill on this case, probably had maybe more matches than I needed. I definitely had more test takers than I needed, but um, the number of actual descendants of the hypothesized father Lewis I thought was just adequate. Now, with the cases in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly that have been solved with DNA evidence recently, I read through those and looked and saw how many test takers, where the test takers are the usually like the author or the author and their siblings or the descendants of the research subject. And then the matches are the descendants of the hypothesized ancestor that the case study is trying to prove to. So for the last 4 articles that came out in 2023 that included autosomal DNA, the first one was by Elizabeth Schoen Mills about identifying a teenage mother in rural pre-1850 America, where she used the fan club methodology to suggest the name of Shadrach Odom's first wife, and then she used autosomal DNA matches only to herself. She found 14 matches that were helpful, and she actually had 2 groups of matches that she used. The first group descended from the family of Shadrach Odom's first wife that she had hypothesized. And then she went back 2 more generations and found an additional set of matches that came from that woman's grandparents. Then on Tom Jones' article, he had 7 descendants of Virginia Jones that he compared against 8 matches that were from the hypothesized um, siblings of Virginia. And then Catherine Damaris's article about the Northamers, she had 4 test takers who descended from Nancy and 8 matches who were from the Northamers. So that helped her prove her case, which um, she had really kind of weak documentary evidence. So the DNA evidence was really needed in her case. And the same with all of these, actually, they really needed the DNA evidence. And then this article by Karen Stanberry about Charles Mapes and Maggie McBurney, the parents of Myrtle Ava Porter DeWine. She had 6 descendants of Myrtle and found matches to 18 people who were descendants of um, different groups. We had some descendants of Charles Mapes' family, Maggie McBurney's family, and so she had quite a bit of matches here. So hopefully that helps to think about how many test takers and how many matches are needed. It's definitely an anomaly to have only 1 test taker here for this article. Usually there will be more than 1 descendant of the research subject whose matches are used to compare against the descendants of the hypothesized ancestor. But you can see there's usually more than 2 or 3 matches here. We've got on average about 8 to 10 matches and then some higher articles. So if you're wondering if you have enough DNA matches to help you prove your case, um, you can't really just tell by having a number. It has to do with if you've thought of all of the different possible answers to the research question and been able to rule them out. And if you've been able to rule those out by having those matches that show that it can't be this line and it can't be that line, then you've probably solved your case. And that might take just 2 matches, or it could take 25. So it just depends on your case. But these numbers can help us see kind of what's being done, and definitely reading articles where people have solved their case will also help us to know, have I solved my case? So if you still have a doubt in your mind about your case and you're still not exactly sure, I've been there, and that's how I felt about the mother of Bathsheba Tharp. I thought at first that it was the the second wife of Louis, Joanna. But then I had that doubt in my mind that it wasn't quite right. And so as I brought the research back 2 more generations, I found it was definitely Louis Tharp's first wife. And now I have no doubt at all because I have found matches descending from the first wife through her father and through her grandparents. So that one, I have sealed the deal with a lot of matches from different generations. So just keep looking for matches that descend from your research subject and through their parents, and that can be one way to help you solve the case. All right. I hope that helps, and um, good luck as you look to find enough DNA matches to help you solve your case.